remarks here before we get into the bulk of the discussion, presentation. Hello again, everyone. Welcome to our final program from our Debate One-on-One series. My name is Britton Ellis, and I am the Civic Librarian at Carnegie Library at Pittsburgh. I'd like to welcome you all to our program. I would like to let you know that this program is being recorded and we will be sharing with all registered attendees as well. We will be uploading a recording to our CivicCLP YouTube playlist. As you listen to the presentation, you are encouraged to share questions in the Zoom chat box and Q&A found at the bottom of your screen. And we'll do our best to answer those questions within the time allotted at the end. While things have been going really smoothly, I do just want to say that we do sometimes experience some technical glitches, and so feel free to reach out to us. We can help troubleshoot as best as we can. And I do also want to mention some community agreements that have been written for this virtual event. By participating today through Q&A or in the comments, you are agreeing to the following. Keep it relevant. This discussion is focused on fundamentals of debate and learning how to explain your ideas and assess different viewpoints from school and professional settings during political discussions or through written publication. Please do your best to tailor your questions and comments to the topic at hand. Keep it kind, treat everyone in the virtual space with respect, and keep it positive. Opinions will vary and all opinions are valid. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Georgia Bedford. Dr. Bedford is a full-time faculty member in the Department of Communication at the University of Pittsburgh and acting associate director of the William Pitt Debating Union. As a co-curricular program, WPDU works with students, faculty, and leadership to convene public debates and perform outreach activities to address salient and pressing topics confronting local, regional, and national communities. The union, regularly collaborates with universities throughout the Pittsburgh area to host domestic debates as well as foreign national teams as they tour the United States. Among the international teams, WPDU has entertained the British, Japanese, New Zealand, South African, Russian, and Irish national teams with plans to host students from Rwanda in late 2023. Dr. Bedford earned her PhD from Duquesne University with concentrations in organizational communication, interpersonal communication, and communication ethics in the public sphere. Dr. Bedford continues her research into the interdisciplinary consequence of rhetorical studies in education. In addition to the release of a book chapter in early 2024, she has a book proposal currently under review. Welcome, Dr. Bedford.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Glad to be back this week. This is our last session, so I'm wrapping up on what started out as the foundations of argument, because argument is at the root of debate. So we've been talking a lot about those principles, and when I am engaging with my debate students, I'm giving you basically everything that we use in our arsenal to develop debates in terms of the theories and methods for critically evaluating arguments and evidence. So tonight, I'm going to talk more specifically about critically analyzing media messages, or critical thinking and media literacy. So one of the first things we need to do is talk about why on earth we need a theory of media literacy. And W. James Potter is one of the premier scholars in media literacy theory. And he talks a lot about the reasons why we need a theory of media literacy. And we've reached this point in our society where we are dealing with an awful lot on a daily basis coming at us, and we just don't know how to deal with all of that. So he puts this into three categories by which he addresses the problems that we are having, and kind of where we have placed ourselves, some of it consciously and some of it unconsciously, because we're trying to process too much. And so he splits this into, these historical access to information and where we are in our contemporary society. He talks about the information fatigue we feel on a daily basis and what that causes us to do when we move into automatic processing. So, one of the things that he really stresses is the fact that, we become oriented toward our needs. And when we feel ourselves being bombarded, we try to psychologically protect ourselves by moving into this mode of automatic processing. And this is a way that we protect our minds from the majority of messages that are coming through. But the problem is that there's a cost to that, because we narrow our exposure to much of the information we actually need. So we are kind of creating additional problems. So we in turning to these automatic processes, which in themselves, he talks about extensively, is being controlled by the media. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the founding scholarship on that, and just kind of where he's coming from when he talks about being conditioned by the media. He's not the first person to say that, for sure. But we, in turn, when we're trying to get into this protection mode and we start just automatically processing because we just can't internalize and interpret all of that, we actually satisfy the media's goal, and that comes at our own expense. So, rather than pursuing information on the basis of our own motivations and needs, and really seeking that information, we're just too exhausted by this entire process. So we succumb to the motivating reasons why the media constructs messages, and they are definitely constructed. And what happens is that our perception of the real world can become skewed over time. And you see a lot of this happening. And, we are very subject as a result to misinterpretations, misrepresentations, misunderstandings, and out and out lies. And I talked extensively about that in the first session when I was talking about the need for argument and media to engage in truth seeking. And I'm actually going to talk about some of the rules of journalism, so that the kind of the basic code of ethics that they're supposed to be following in theory, but that's not actually what is happening in practice. So, what we're giving up with this focus on the efficiency of automatically processing information is that we lose our ability to critically analyze information. We lose our critical thinking skills over time. So we are, in fact, and don't be insulted by this, we are dumbing ourselves down over time. And we do have, one of the reasons why we hold a session like this is to give you the skills to come back and to be more present in your daily life and have an awareness as to what it is that you're being exposed to. So under access to information, that first bullet point in Potter's theory about why we need media literacy is that we are in a culture that is flooded with media messages. And he talks about access in terms of historically, when we were structured differently and we, had a lot of difficulty when we were, getting across the from one place to another on horses and buggies. It took a very long time to send and receive messages. And by the time you received a message, it was probably too late to do anything about it if it was, very important, or it would, most likely become irrelevant at that point. But we also had limited access to people that had important information, like learned scholars that we would have wanted to have access to. So in the form of books and, various print media, there just, was a time when we didn't have that. And in fact, many people didn't even know how to read. So now we've come into a different problem where we are absolutely being flooded all the time with information, and we're expected to constantly sort through this. And some of that has an intention, which we'll talk about shortly when we talk about Edward Bernays, the father of PR. But, we now have digital outlets, and with the internet, that just expanded everything, because we already had, I sometimes joke, and I think I said this last session, that the day that I defended my dissertation, I felt like the most ignorant person on the planet, because I realized in that moment, and it's not that that was the first moment that I realized it, but I really had an awakening in my soul and in my heart that there were so many things I wanted to learn that I hadn't had the chance to learn. Because when you're doing an advanced education degree, your focus is very narrow and it's limited. And that is a choice. So you are selectively choosing to do that. But the way that we're choosing to deal with information is also narrowing our exposure to things. And for me, it was the insight, the awareness that I wanted to read all of these books and articles, but I would never have the opportunity to read everything that there is to read and learn out there. But because we're flooded with all of this information, what we're doing is eliminating information and moving into a different point of kind of this, consciousness that's rooted in, ignorance. And I don't say that to be insulting, but ignorance is simply having a lack of information about things. And some of the stuff that Potter examined in his scholarship is where we are now versus what we have come from. And he looks at things like when computers came to be, ubiquitous across every household. And he says that at one time back in the 1980s, less than 5% of people had computers in their homes. And now we'd be hard pressed to find a home that does not have a computer. And if you've got children, of course, then you know that they need computers just to do their schoolwork. And now we have this virtual environment. So we keep adding these new forms by which we communicate and interact with each other. And it's really made the landscape extremely complex. So he talks about the production of information, and he says that it accelerates. He calls it the information production accelerates. And he talks about the rates at which information is produced. And he cites the scholarship of John Nesbitt, who in 1984 looked at early 1980s scientific and technical information. And he found that it was doubling every 5.5 years. And he expected that rate to increase exponentially. And he anticipated that that doubling phenomenon would accelerate further, so that instead of every 5.5 years doubling, it would be every 20 months by the 1990s. So you can imagine that the calculations would be off the charts at this point. There's just no way to even conceive of how that rate has accelerated especially as we added new technologies, and we now have internet and constant exposure to digital sources of information. So what does this result in? We can't keep up, and keeping up has become a job in and of itself. And so this problem has shifted from access to abundance. There's just too much, and we're long past any point of saturation with this. And so, we just keeping up with information is one thing, but then you add to it the rate at which that information is continuously flowing. And this causes us to want to just isolate ourselves from it. And I will tell you, there are times that I just cannot handle the information because I'm in an information environment and I'm constantly teaching, and I just become overloaded. And there are times that I don't want to watch the news, and I just emotionally and mentally cannot. And I have to unplug. And realistically, you have to do that. But you also have to make decisions about when you're going to do that. You know, when you feel that you need that mental health break, you have to take it. And it's important to be able to recognize that, because, you know, this constant 24/7 exposure, especially to news all the time. You've got these networks that have, you know, if you wake up in the middle of the night because you can't sleep, you can find, you know, entertainment by turning on the TV, and there's news right there. And, you know, he talks about this unplanned and unconscious exposure everywhere we go. And we're even finding products being embedded into movies and television. Product placement is very common, and you'll find, you know, somebody walks into a room and they'll say, oh, hand me a Coke or a Pepsi or something of that nature. And then they'll make a decisive move to show the label. Excuse me. And you also see things like a tire being talked about and so forth. And marketing has been just evolving in its intensity. And apparently there was a time, I don't know where this stands, but apparently there was a time in Sweden where marketers were attempting to interrupt people in their private phone calls. And I would be very curious. I didn't have a chance to go. I was reading about this, and I was just very shocked. I did not have a chance to go and look that up, but I'm probably going to look at that, because you know, I deal with media literacy and critical thinking, teaching it, and you know, I'm very curious about what happened with that, because that was some time ago. I think that was in the 80s. And the other thing about this is that marketers are so focused on quantity rather than quality. And their goal is to hit you with as many ads as they possibly can. So there's something else that we need to look at as a result of that. So there are two basic models of communication or advertising. And one is designed to exploit, the other is supposed to seek to establish what is common, or, you know, establishing that common ground. And we talked about the difference between establishing common ground when that's a possibility, and establishing new ground or creating new ground when common ground really can be a limitation, especially when, you know, there's something that's extremely contentious. So what's the difference between these two? Well, with marketing, with both of these, you do what is called an audience analysis. You look at situational characteristics, which is, you know, geographically, where are people situated? What is their location? You know, what are they surrounded by? What is their situation in terms of their family life and so forth? They look at demographics, all the things from age to race and gender and sex and socioeconomic status, all of these things. Psychoanalytic, they're trying to figure out how people think about things, what their feelings are, what their values are. All of these things are designed under the marketing model to identify what things are different between people. So in identifying those differences, what they're trying to do is exploit them and create a target market. So when they can target that audience, they seek to create that separation. I'll give you an example. If you look at ads, if you were to, and this is an exercise I sometimes do with my students, we'll look at various ads. I'll find ads that are targeted to an audience that is wealthy versus one that's targeted to an audience that doesn't have as much money. So let's look at the difference between Lord and Taylor and Target, or Saks Fifth Avenue and Target. Two completely different markets, because if you can afford to go into Saks Fifth Avenue, you might have $2,500 to spend on a bottle of perfume. So those commercials are tailored to be very sleek, very sophisticated, and exclusionary of anybody that can't afford that, because you would never think of going into those places. And The other thing that you have to think about is when you look at a target ad, they are typically tailored to families and people that don't have a lot of money. So you see these huge ads about sales all the time and, buy one, get one 50% off. Well, if we're in Saks Fifth Avenue, we simply do not speak of money because that would be vulgar. So, I mean, it is just a difference in approaching an audience, and they're exploiting those differences in order to create difference and further create separation. And you have to really think about the way those things impact you and impact your buying habits. So under the democratic model, the goal is to identify differences and identify similarities and focus more on what the similarities are, because we're trying to seek or establish common ground so that we can collaborate, we can be a part of a larger civic community. And so you have to know which one you're being exposed to. Now, that is also not to say that you don't have marketing aspects in democratic models, and democratic does not indicate any kind of governmental structure. It's just a different model. We are exposed to things without really understanding that that's what's happening. So it's important to know those differences. So one of the other that second target of why we need media literacy is information fatigue and how we come to devalue messages, for example. So this is what's called selective attention or selective listening. And we teach this when we're teaching the active listening models, and we're talking about communication process models. We talk about all of the barriers to a message being received and the way that it is being sent, and whether that audience, that target audience, can decode that message and understand the message and get the meaning of it. But if you are thinking about that in terms of an exchange between two people, and now you exponentially increase those numbers and the exposure to information, and you're given no other choice but to selectively pay attention to some things, because how can you possibly, perceive everything? Because we're constantly perceiving, and we have to be able to sometimes block certain things out, which we call noise. So all of those barriers are sometimes in the way of our ability to not just understand something, but they kind of force us to make decisions about, look, I can't handle all of this, and I really need to manage this. I need to manage this constant overflow of information. But determining what is important and what we can disregard is a more complex venture than we can possibly speculate. And sometimes we necessarily do this at times when we shouldn't, at times when it would be beneficial for us to listen and learn something. And one of the times when we need to do that is when we're being given facts, and we need to question those facts and evaluate the sources of those facts. And unfortunately, as we're kind of disengaging and devaluing messages, those facts, become a part of that filter. And they kind of turn us into, this kind of robotic mindset where it's just in one ear and out the other. And we kind of discount the facts, even if there is strong evidence indicating that the facts are true and it comes from a credible source. We just we either ignore it or we take it as the golden rule and assume that, oh, this is somebody I can trust automatically and I don't have to question. Well, guess what? You have to question everything. And I'm going to give you an example of that when I talk about Edward Bernays. And so we come to think of facts as fluid and, kind of characteristic of that accelerated atmosphere. And that results in two things. So, important information can be dismissed and, even when you should, but this constant news cycle can cause you to have a hypervigilance about other kinds of information. So if you think about when COVID first started and we were being exposed to these messages about it, everyone just went into this state of panic because there was just too much, and it was overwhelming and it really was an unfair thing to, put these numbers up where we're constantly focusing on death. And this became a part of the 24/7 news cycle. And quite honestly, it was an exploitation of the human suffering that was going on. And, we're dealing with some things that can be exacerbated, but other things that we should be exposed to in a limited capacity in a setting and by individuals who do have the authority to speak on them, not just random people coming on and giving their opinions, and in a manner that is serious and professional and structured. So we should have that expectation, but I think that we've lost the ability to even know what it is that we need. So some of this devaluation comes about as a process of the information or the nature of information itself changing. So this refers, like I said, to that quality where things are just coming at you, and you're getting all of this, quite frankly, nonsense from people that don't really have the credentials to speak on things. And the other part of that is now messages are very short, and we get these sound bites, and we expect people to provide very short answers to what should be a lengthy answer to a complex question. And if we're watching someone, for example, and they're being interviewed, and they would give substantive answers, and they go into a detailed explanation to give you everything you need to know to understand a complex situation or problem. And they're kind of cut off, and maybe the journalist will say, well, we're short on time. And so these sound bites of information are inadequate, and it's only a teaser to what should be a deeper conversation about things. So the other thing that happens is that we don't know whether we're getting information or entertainment or ads. And some of the models for media now tend to cross over all three of those things, especially due to the sponsorships and corporate sponsorships. And I'll be making a couple of book recommendations to help you understand those things better. But sometimes we're watching something and it looks like it's maybe a documentary or an informational type of a show. And so we even call these infomercials now, because they really are, we find out, a commercial. It's an advertisement for something, and it looks legitimate, and they'll have people, maybe it's pushing some type of medication or herb, and you have these people in lab coats, and they talk about double-blind studies, and it just has the presentation of being something very serious and credible. And in fact, it's actually not. And the other thing that happens is pundits and a lot of people they interview don't cite information. They don't cite sources of information. They don't give you any way to follow up and verify that. So remember, I said in the very first session that argument is evidence. And if we can't prove that something is valid, we can't follow up and force people to justify their claims, then we should discount those messages altogether, because chances are that you're dealing with bias. Okay, so there's a study that was done, and we need to just get really into corporate sponsorship and who controls media and who is constructing messages and who's making decisions about these messages. And there was a study done by an individual, by Bogdikian, I think it is. I'm so terribly botching that name. I'm not really sure, but the study essentially was conducted as an analysis of media ownership patterns. And back in 1983, this is when this was really becoming serious in terms of public awareness of it. In 1983, he discovered that media control had fallen into the hands of 50 people. Okay, so this had been evolving for some time. That's a very small group of people to control the entire media network that's out there. But those individuals were CEOs of large media companies, and they held a combined control of half the revenues and audiences in their media markets. But that does not even touch where we are today, because Forbes actually did another study, and I haven't seen one more recent than this. This is the last research I saw on it. And I think this was from about 4 years ago, but not a lot has changed in this regard. But they found that the limited number of people has actually shifted to media conglomerates that are operated by 15 billionaires. So Kate Vinton, I'm going to read this quote. Kate Vinton, she's a Forbes staffer, and she reported some billionaires like Rupert Murdoch and Michael Bloomberg are longtime media moguls who made their fortunes in the news business. Others, like Amazon founder Jeff Bezos, bought publications as a side investment after building a substantial fortune in another industry. Billionaires own part or all of America's influential nationwide newspapers, including the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. In addition to magazines, local papers and online publications are a part of that ownership. Several other billionaires, including Comcast CEO Brian Roberts and Liberty Media Chairman John Malone, I'm not sure if he's still there, own or control cable TV networks that are powerful but not primarily news focused. So I call these types of outlets entertainment news, because a lot of what you're seeing there, as I said, there's no evidence presented, there are no sources that are cited, so you don't have a way to verify any of that information. So I'm also going to provide a source to you, and it is the Society of Professional Journalists, and they have a code of ethics, and they cover 4 primary territories here. And it's actually, I'm going to provide Britton with a PDF file, and this comes directly from their site, and it says seek truth and report it. And that truth-seeking mission as the aim of argumentation is something that journalism is supposed to aspire to. And we did have a time when we had this muckraking, accountable set of journalists, and those muckrakers were out there to find truth. But increasingly, as sponsorship and ownership shifted into the hands of the private companies, that changed. And so now media is shaped by that ownership and the messaging that is a part of those sponsorships. So under one of those bullets, it says take responsibility for the accuracy of the work and verify information before releasing it. And use original sources wherever possible. You almost never see that. Minimize harm. So ethical journalism treats sources, subjects, colleagues, and members of the public as human beings deserving of respect. That is what that is supposed to mean. So that is supposed to be a balance of the public's need for information and balance the public's need for information against potential harm or discomfort, and pursuit of the news is not a license for arrogance or undue intrusiveness. So we're seeing many violations here in this. And let me just check the chat here because someone does have a comment. Okay, that's Britton just found that, and Britton is just so on top of everything. It's so wonderful to work with her. Act independently. So the highest and primary obligation of ethical journalism is to serve the public. So one of those top bullets is avoid conflicts of interest, real or perceived, and disclose unavoidable conflicts. Now, we've seen some individuals sanction. I think Chris Cuomo is a good example of that, with the conflict of interest, helping his brother in his campaign up in New York, and he was subsequently fired for that. But he was made really a scapegoat for what is predominant in the field. And this happens all the time. And, you know, we need to, if we really want to hold people accountable, we need to begin asking questions about that independence. We do have some independent journalistic outlets, and you're going to find most of those on some of the channels. Like there's one called Freedom of Information or something of that nature, but it's more, I follow certain you know, pundits and outlets that are independently funded. In other words, they don't take money from corporate sponsors, and they take donations from individuals and probably some groups. Does that mean that they're absolutely independent? No, I don't think so, because everybody does have to respond to this pressurized environment to some extent. And, you know, there is oversight over things. And we have to just make sure that, you know, that we're aware of that. Yes, Democracy Now! Is actually a really good one, and I do watch that one a lot, and you find a lot of unbiased journalism there. But the other one, I didn't mean to skip over that. The last one on this is be accountable. And so this idea about being accountable and transparent. So ethical journalism means taking responsibility for one's work and explaining one's decisions to the public. So journalists should explain ethical choices and processes to audiences, encourage a civil dialogue with the public about journalistic practices, coverage, and news content. So these are all things that are very important for us to be mindful of. And, you know, part of what is happening is that because we have checked out and, you know, we know that these things are happening, we know we're getting biased information. And bias is a form of censorship because it excludes any voices that counter that outcome that is being sought, and that is to persuade the audience that something is a certain way. And so if you think about it as a form of censorship, that can help you understand better how dangerous that bias can be. So all of these things kind of move us into this automatic processing and, you know, the way we respond to this flood of information, the default mode we move into to establish that psychological protection, and the faulty meaning construction that results from all of that. So again, Potter actually states that, you know, our society is actually characterized by aggressive media. He calls them aggressive. And he says that there's no way to really avoid this exposure because it's coming at us from every direction. I mean, if you walk outside, you see bumper stickers, you see billboards, you see, you know, advertisements of all kinds, and you see it on vehicles, city buses, and that can buy ad space. So I mean, you don't have to go far. And as soon as you turn on the radio, I made the choice a long time ago not to even listen to live radio unless I'm listening to podcasts. And I do listen to a lot of podcasts because those are avenues that do allow you to have a greater exposure to information that you are getting the sources of and can verify, and you have deeper discussions about things, you know, indicating the complexity of information. But, you know, the thing that's happened is that, you know, we have developed this intolerance, not intolerance, tolerance to the point where, because we can't avoid them, we kind of just, that's our path of least resistance. We kind of check ourselves out. Oh, this commercial is on. And if you watch YouTube for 5 minutes, you will have had 3 ads in that space of time, depending on the popularity of the show. And, you know, you just kind of check out if you can't fast forward it or you can't skip over ads, you just kind of tolerate it. But this is kind of a mental expenditure in itself because we're still in avoidance mode. And so it's stressful when you're trying to, you know, even tolerate things, because you do, I mean, it does get in, and you know, these info bits of information, you might find yourself humming something that was on a commercial, and you unconsciously pick that up and you didn't even know. And that gets in your head, and you're, going through this all day, and you just can't do anything about that. And so what you have to do is kind of replace that with something else that you want to have going through your mind. So this default mode of processing information, it's this phenomenon that happens. And when we lack awareness about, how the media is actually affecting us, and the processing of influence, and how this is affecting our lives, because it is adding to the level of the anxiety that we're feeling. And even moving into this default mode of processing, it really is an indication of how completely exhausted you're feeling. And, the designers and processors of media messages have a very strong influence over this exposure and decisions as to what messaging you're going to get. So let me just check chat again very quickly. Yeah, YouTube has been pushing YouTube Premium, and I won't pay for it because I get that for that content. I don't blame anyone for paying just to have sanity, because the commercials are just so obnoxious. And Patreon is another option that gives you the opportunity, and a lot of the independent podcast and journalistic outlets use Patreon to fund their shows, and a lot of the documentary channels do the same thing. And so those are good opportunities if you like what you're hearing and you feel that you are learning things that you never heard before. Those are two good ways to just, pay for YouTube Premium, so you can silence all that noise and really concentrate on what you want to watch. And certainly Patreon is that kind of lean forward into the reconstruction of the journalistic landscape, and saying, look, we don't want to have these this meaning matching and this constant associations and telling us what the interpretation of things mean into these automatic modes, because we're not learning. And as I said, we're losing our ability to critically think through things. Now, honestly, you do have to categorize some information just for your own sanity. I mean, you couldn't get up every day and think about, okay, it's morning, I have to go through this list. I have to brush my teeth. I have to take a shower. I have to make breakfast. I have to make coffee. I have to pull out an outfit to wear. You don't do that. You have to categorize. These are all of the actions that belong to this morning behavior and activities. So categorization is not without purpose, but when we start categorizing things and moving into generalizations and stop asking questions, that's when we move into kind of surface level judgments. And that removes us from taking into responsibility from constructing meaning ourselves. And, this does allow us to take, it's less of mental energy if we can just have somebody, well, just tell me what to think about this, or tell me what this means. And Edward Bernays actually described people as herds, and just channeling herds into the next, pen where they're supposed to go. Oh, here's a shiny object. I'm going to dangle this in front of them. And this is what that 24/7 news cycle does. I'm going to tell them where to go over here, and I'm going to focus their attention on this. And now I'm going to change that and focus it on this. And unfortunately, there's a secondary effect because the consequence is that there's a negative impact. When we do this, we are constraining our own choices, and we play into that in a number of ways. And so Marshall McLuhan, I actually want to read a quote from him. And he talked about, along with this faulty meaning structure that we develop. Just give me a second to find my quote here. He talks about this new science of media, and talking about the media is the message. And let me just see if I can find this really quickly. But essentially, it's in a different book. Let me see. I have so many books here. It's just crazy. There it is. Okay. It is in a book called Understanding Media, the Extensions of Man. And Marshall McLuhan is one of the premier scholars. If you are aware of the show Mad Men, you see this is largely about Edward Bernays, whom I'm going to talk about. And there's a joke my chair just told me about today about Marshall McLuhan. Someone was making reference to a person who had McLuhan as the last name, and somebody caught on to that, and they thought it was Marshall McLuhan because he was the advertising and PR genius. And he says in his first chapter called "The Medium is the Message," he talks about, in a culture like ours, long accustomed to splitting and dividing all things as a means of control, it is sometimes a bit of a shock to be reminded that in operational and practical fact, the medium is the message. This is merely to say that the personal and social consequences of any medium, that is, any extension of ourselves, result from the new scale that is introduced into our affairs by each extension of ourselves or by new technologies. So he talks about these new patterns of human communication. And he says, with automation, the new patterns of human association tend to do some things like eliminate, like he talks about elimination of jobs and how that all happened. But he talked about the fact that we remove the in-depth interaction that we have and the human association that we can develop. And, he says that this is the negative impulse or negative result. Positively, he talks about the positive aspects of it, that you do feel that you have new roles sometimes in conversations. So especially with social media, these new platforms gave people the opportunity to feel that they were a part of larger conversations. But I also talked about last week the difference between the public sphere and the private sphere. And there are other spheres, and a sphere is really the creation of the language that's being constructed and the medium that is used. In the public sphere, which becomes social media, which is not subject to journalistic rules, you can feel that you are part of conversations that are important, but you have to ask yourself, should I really be a part of this conversation, or is this something that should be taking place in the private sphere? Because people are just kind of putting every single thing out there. And he says the medium shapes and controls the scale and form of human association and action. And, we can't operate with a clear vision when we're constantly being bombarded by people's opinions and people that don't have the authority to speak on issues. And I read from you last week a quote from Aristotle about that people that speak on things should have the expertise, the credentials. And so when I talk about the authority to speak, I'm talking about, has someone the experience? Do they have the degrees? Do they have, the application of that in terms of their practice? So in other words, time accumulated and a great deal of study in something. And if they don't, then why are they speaking on that? And you have to push back and say, well, what do you know? Where did you get your information? And what is your background here? Another book is, that I'm going to get into. It talks about, what we were talking about before, and I'm going to read to you a little bit. Edward Bernays wrote a couple of books. It's in Crystallizing Public Opinion that he refers to people as herds. But in this book called Propaganda, and on the front page, propaganda is spelled out as an acronym, and he talks about the P stands for propaganda, and O is only through the active energy of the intelligent few can the public at large become aware of and act upon new ideas. Bear that in mind, the intelligent few. And the P, the next P in propaganda, he says that propaganda bears the same relation to education as to business and politics. It may be abused. It may be used to over-advertise an institution and to create in the public mind artificial values. There can be no absolute guarantee against its misuse. And the A, presidential candidate, a presidential candidate may be drafted in response to overwhelming popular demand, but it is well known that his name may be decided upon by half a dozen men sitting around a table in a hotel room. Some of these things are shocking, but he is the father of these movements. Governments, governments, whether they are monarchical, I can't even see that my lighting in my office is very bad here. Constitutional, democratic, or communist depend upon acquiescent public opinion for the success of their efforts. And in fact, government is government only by virtue of public acquiescence. As civilization has become more complex and as the need for invisible government, I'm going to explain that one in a minute, has been increasingly demonstrated, the technical means have been invented and developed by which opinion may be regimented. The end, nowadays, the successors of the rulers, those whose position or ability gives them power, can no longer do what they want without the approval of the masses. They find in propaganda a tool which is increasingly powerful in gaining that approval. The democracy is administered by the intelligent minority who know how to regiment and guide the masses. An entire party, a platform, an international policy is sold to the public or is not sold on the basis of the tangible element of personality. So that is actually, he spells it out, that's right on the front cover of this book. So let's go into a little bit what he means by this. So actually the word prior to World War I, propaganda was not a negative word. And it is only, in the 19th century that it took on a more pejorative meaning. And actually, what it used to be, the word had been coined in 1622 when Pope Gregory XV, frightened by the global spread of Protestantism, urgently proposed an addition to the Roman Curia, the Office for the Propaganda of the Faith, which would supervise the church's missionary efforts in the New World and elsewhere. They are to take into account of and deal with each and every concern for the spread of the faith throughout the world. Far from denoting lies, half-truths, selective history, or any other tricks that we associate with propaganda now, that word meant at first the total and opposite of such deceptions. And so the word started out that way, but over time it changed. And what is this next quote I wanted to read to you? Now he talks about, Mark Crispin Miller wrote the foreword to propaganda, and that's actually what I'm reading from. And he said, now public opinion stood out as a force through these changes in propaganda that took on this pejorative meaning in the 19th century. And so he says, now public opinion stood out as a force that must be managed, and not through clever guesswork, but by experts trained to do that all-important job. And in fact, propaganda and Bernays himself throughout his long career sold something more than all the goods and services his clients offered, and also something more than propaganda as a necessary tool for businessmen and politicians. Bernays sold the myth of propaganda as a wholly rational endeavor carried out methodically by careful experts skilled enough to lead public opinion. So he cast himself as master manipulator of that, and mastering the responses of a pliable, receptive population, conscious and intelligent manipulation, invisible governors, they who pull the wires which control the public mind, shrewd persons operating behind the scenes. And he really does use some strong language here. Dictators exercising great power, and below them people working as if actuated by the touch of a button. These are but a few of the expressions of this IC paradigm that evidently, this drove Edward Bernays's practice. And so this is kind of this unseen mechanism, he says, organizing chaos. You have these few individuals at the very top making all of these decisions. And so it's a little bit scary when you think about that. But that's really what we're talking about. And this was, Edward Bernays was on the scene. Let me see when he first published. I think he first published this in 1928. His first publication, this first version of propaganda, and then it's been republished multiple times. And when we teach media literacy and we teach actual courses about propaganda, this book is used heavily, and Potter's Theory, Marshall McLuhan, all the ones that I'm talking to you about. So there's another aspect to this, though, in the narrowing of information, and it's called algorithms. So your patterns, your habits of viewing and narrowing yourself in information that you're seeking, it actually comes to be used against you. And you have these giants, Google, Facebook, Twitter, all the social media giants and many of the media companies got together and decided they were going to track the viewing habits and the reading habits and shopping habits, and every single thing that you do online is constantly being tracked. And what happens is these algorithms kick in and they start tailoring ads to, oh, you were looking at a pair of shoes last week, so all of a sudden now you're seeing shoes pop up, and you'll see advertisements on the pages you go to, or you looked at this shopping site and you'll start to see ads from there. Even worse, when whether you have ever had a Facebook account or not, they're tracking. And what you find is the information that you are exposed to, especially if you're doing Google searches, becomes more and more tailored to those viewing habits. So if you have been engaging in some behaviors, looking at certain individuals who have a certain ideology, you'll start to get content that is tailored toward that perspective. So you start to narrow yourself, and you can test this by not signing in to any account whatsoever and doing the same search you've done over and over again, independent of your sign in, your IP address, anything. Go to a library, for example, and search for the same thing and see what the results are. They will be very different. And we have a question in chat. Yes, it does happen in YouTube. It happens everywhere. YouTube is one of the ones that is, a party to this kind of thing. So yes, it absolutely does happen in YouTube. And when you are watching, if you're watching something, the ads that do pop up, they're often tailored to something. Like I was looking at a coffee brand, and because I was thinking about trying this coffee, and I started to see ads on that. And that's just a recent example that I can think of. But it starts to personalize content, starts personalizing video advertising, the content that you're exposed to. So you start operating in a silo of information, which becomes an echo chamber, because they're all the same voices. You're not getting any difference in perspectives. And that's where that kind of tolerating and narrowing and checking out and just becoming overwhelmed by information, that's what that can do to you, because you start looking at the same things, the same sources of information and so forth, and then you really start to suffer in terms of your learning. And so I have a source here for evaluating digital sources. I will send this to Brooke. This is disseminated by many of the colleges and universities, and I'm going to talk to you about digital sources, and then I'm going to talk to you about evaluating sources in general. So accuracy. So if the author is not listed on the page, the author, the institution with whom that person is with, you should know who is writing the content on that page. You should also have the option to contact that author and ask questions. I have done that. Sometimes things are hosted by just a web host, and they're not actually writing content. They're doing the technical work, so they're not there to verifying anything. Someone is asking, was it a coincidence that I field a new description, got a YouTube video suggesting that the drug, no, it's not. That is not a coincidence. And in fact, your debit card, your credit cards are sharing that data. And your shopping habits are constantly being monitored. You can go into, I've had this happen, you can go into a location and just have your wallet on you. And later, I have had ads pop up in my email address related to the place where I just was. So this is happening all the time, all around you. So the second area here is the authority. So if your page lists the author's credentials, it should also list some things that you can link to. And it should be a site that's .edu, .org, .net, but that does not guarantee the accuracy or authority of the author. And it should also be objective. So if it provides information, you should be able to check that information. You should be able to check the sources. There should be limited advertising, and you shouldn't have ads running all over the thing. And the information is objective. It's not, extremely biased and skewed. So then we get into currency. So if the page is current and up to date, the page should have the last update. And it should tell you when that last update was so that you can verify whether the information is current. So it's really important for you to be able to evaluate a site, because if you can't check all of those things, then you don't want to use that information. And the last thing is coverage. So there shouldn't be any information there that you have to pay for. So no paid content, no special software, no membership requirements, any of that stuff. You should be able to browse the information and check the sources of that information freely. So another thing that I teach my students about, these are both lessons that I teach my students. This is a criteria I teach in argument, and it is what is called STAR. And it is called STAR because, same thing, it is an acronym. So the S stands for sufficiency. Is the information sufficient means several things. So sufficient in terms of enough and the type of evidence that you need to properly evaluate something. So do you have a sufficient amount of evidence? Includes if that information is of the kind that you can understand. So for example, if you have statistics, that writer should be explaining, because explanations are part of that evidence chain. Examples to help you better understand how this is applied. You should also have things like maybe charts or graphs to help you visualize statistics that are talked about, so that you can understand better what that looks like. If you see a large number, sometimes just mentioning a statistic isn't representative enough. So you need to actually see visually how large that sample or that number really is. So it means a lot of things, but just for sake of time, let's go to T. Typicality and representativeness. If an author or a speaker is using an example that is so ridiculous, it does not resonate with most people, it's not typical to their experience. So when I teach my students about this, I talk to them about, if something isn't typical, then it probably doesn't represent the experience most people have. So, if you see an ad, I'm just going to make up something ridiculous. You see an ad and they're telling you, oh, just put aloe vera on your arthritic knees. And they cite the case of a person that used aloe vera, which is a plant and very, helpful in its own ways, I'm sure. But if you have arthritis and you just take this leaf and you put this medication on there, and yes, this is ridiculous on purpose because it does happen. That's not typical for what people do. It's not a typical recommendation. It's not a typical example of what someone would do in this case. It's not typical of what an expert would recommend that you put on for arthritic knees. So therefore, it does not have the representativeness that it should have to be applied in a broader sense. Okay, so accuracy means, is it up to date? Is it accurate in terms of what we know about this now? So in other words, we use different methods of determining how old evidence should be, depending upon what the science is that we're dealing with, because argument is an interdisciplinary course. So for some sciences, there's a 5-year window of usability in terms of evidence and finding articles to support an argument's claims. And if you go beyond that, it is only because, and you would have to explain, there isn't anything new. New studies have to be done because what we have now is old, and it may not represent any information that we would find now if we were to conduct a new study. So that would only be the case if the information that you found was older than 5 years. So it's considered to be up to date if it's within that 5 years. Accuracy, again, means a lot of things, but let's move on to relevance. Sometimes you hear a lot of really nice stories about something, but is it relevant? Does it add to the argument? Does it help you understand the argument better? Does it relate to the experience that they're describing among the people? Or is it just something that's a filler? And so we count things like anecdotal accounts in with relevance if it's used as evidence to support something. Anecdotals are good and helpful. They can point us in directions that sometimes become the body of somebody's work and studies. But your limited account of what you experience or what a family member experienced is irrelevant to what we're talking about right now, because it cannot be considered evidence. So we have all of these different ways and different methods for evaluating evidence and tools that we use. So it's a very complex venture, but I give you these so that you understand things have to meet a criteria in order for them to be credible. So we're testing the credibility, the verifiability, and all of these things that we need to examine the authority of experts and, evidence such as testimony. All of that falls under here. So anything that you're faced with, you could probably use that and, use that as a tool, because I think it's simplified enough that you could use both of those as tools to evaluate the sources. And you can literally look, if you're on a digital page and you are not sure whether that is a credible source or not, you could use that page to inform yourself and ask important questions. And hopefully if the author's information is there, you can follow up. But we do have a lot of things like blogs. Anybody can run a blog. Even when there's a scientist running a blog, that scientist might be a conspiracy theorist in their spare time. That might be how they have fun, but that doesn't mean that we would really take that information into account. So there are sources that we consider to be prime, and that is, what we hold our students to using, peer-reviewed journals and books and things of that nature. Books are very helpful, and especially when they're written by people with expertise. And there should be a bio on the author telling you exactly what they are, what their background is and their credentials and all of that. So, there's information overload. Even policy papers can be helpful to understand things, but those can be persuasive too and designed for outcomes. What you really just need is to ask important questions. If you don't feel satisfied that you understand something and there's something you feel confused about, you need more information about, follow up, ask, somebody that is mentioned in, whatever the source is, or start, doing research on your own. But it's just super important to make sure that you try to expose yourself to that, to truth through that journey that we have been talking about this whole series. So that concludes media literacy. Let me just check the chat because I have a question. Yes, I will. I will provide a list to Britain, non-commercial news sources and podcasts. There are several that I do follow, and they all annoy me to some extent. There's one called Breaking Points that I watch, And the beauty of it is that you don't know that one of the pundits is supposed to be conservative and one of the pundits is supposed to be liberal, because they, and we run our debates in this way where we, when we are developing a debate, we research all of the issues together, and you see this format on the show. They understand the topics very clearly. They do shared research. They develop their speaking points. They answer to each other, and they will argue sometimes, holding each other in check. And they always mention the sources that they get information from. So they're independent. There are others, such as the Young Turks, which I would not recommend because they're so extremely biased. It's no better to be liberally biased than it is to be conservative biased, and you know, vice versa. So this show I like because, you know, they are, you most of the time just see them talking through. Sagar and Jenny and Crystal Ball are the two hosts on there, and Sagar is the one who is conservative, and Crystal Ball, she actually was on MSNBC before. There are other ones, but I'll have to look that up. And actually, Joe Rogan has an interesting podcast because he gets experts on there. Now, he's just not, he's a martial artist, and, you know, he mediates fights and things. But the interesting thing about his show is that he has a lot of people on there that are controversial. He doesn't care about their leaning, and all he does is ask them questions. Now, he admits himself that he used to be kind of a jerk, but he has become a very reasonable person. And there are experts on there that will talk about things that mainstream media won't cover. So that's, I do oftentimes listen to it depends on the host. Sometimes he just talks to martial artists and things like that. But if there's a host that I'm interested in, and there's one who was doing, she has a show, and I think it might be on Hulu. And she goes and does documentaries, documenting the experiences of people in different regions where we have perceptions about them and about the people. And there was another one where he was talking about bees and the importance of needing bees to pollinate the plants, and, you know, the fact that plants and flowers, and the fact that they're an important part of the ecosystem, but they are dying off. And, you know, there's this huge mystery as to why they're dying off. So you find people like that. And I'll also recommend some additional websites and places where you can get, you know, good old school speeches delivered by former presidents and things of that nature. So I will work with Britain on that to provide some additional sources of information. So any other questions? You're welcome. I know I covered an awful lot in this session. There's just so much more to cover than there is time. Brittany, you there?
I
I
am.
guess we'll do the same thing and hang around.
Yeah.
Wait to see if people can think of a question.
Yeah.
DuckDuckGo, it's supposed to be, it's more about privacy than it is about finding good content. You can find good content in Google, and there's actually a scholar site for Google. It's called Google Scholar, and you can find a lot of intelligently written articles there. DuckDuckGo is more designed to just make sure that your browsing is private, and it's still imperfect. But you know, if you want to check out the difference between those and put the same search words in both, that's how I would check to see what you're getting through each of those. Yeah, I don't know how much they are a part of that huge conglomerate of moguls to, you know, use those algorithms against you. I'm just not sure. A specific example for STAR criteria. Every single argument can be put to the test for STAR. So if someone is on television and they're talking about the spread of a new disease or something, are they giving you sufficient information? Is the example to understand the issue and the seriousness of the issue? Is the example they're using coming from a third world country where they are predisposed to certain things because they don't have the technology or the resources that we have to, medications, maybe they have poor, exposure to healthy foods and so forth. So make sure that those examples that they provide are coming from a source that you would recognize and understand. Is the information accurate that they're giving you? So you should be able to look that up and verify the information. And is it relevant, or is what they're saying relevant to the issue at hand? Does it help you understand the issue better? Has it supplemented the any outside questions that you would have? I mean, you also use this to question the authority of the person who's speaking. And because that accuracy is also questioning whether somebody has the expertise in giving certain types of information. And if they're providing examples that aren't typical, that's one way that you can kind of test to see, that doesn't really sound right. I wonder where that sample comes from, or I wonder where that study comes from. And I've actually tested this with my doctor and some different things past when I was working with pediatricians and some of the information that they would give me. And I would say, well, where does that study come from? And there were a couple of times that she told me places I just couldn't believe, very poor countries in Africa or something of that nature, that those tests don't apply here. So you have to make sure that things are representative of our population and the needs and problems and issues that we have here. So America is so insular. Are there news outlets? Yeah, outside the BBC can be pretty good, but again, I think they have less maybe of the advertising angle, but I would say that they're still, and BBC News tends to be more comprehensive in its coverage on things. So I think that they can be good. And in fact, that is a news outlet that I do refer to. Al Jazeera is another one. That's an excellent news outlet. And I don't know if they have a YouTube channel anymore. I do read their online information, their online articles and things. And so they can be very good. So the 15 individuals controlling the media, I'm sure we can, I have a list. I'm misplaced here as I was going through. My office is a disaster. I will find that list and give that to Britton, but I'm sure Britton, she's so good with this, she'll find it. But yeah, it's definitely a very limited number of individuals that are controlling media access. So between Britton and myself, we will definitely come up with that information. Any other questions? Give it some thought before we conclude. You're welcome.
As we're kind of waiting on some last minute questions, no pressure, folks. I do kind of want to just say thank you so much to everyone who joined us for this program. And I know I've seen a few names.
Britton, I can't hear you.
To all three. You can't hear me at all? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. All right. I just want to say thanks to everyone who joined us today for this program. And I know that there have been a few who have seen at all three of our programs. And thank you so much, Dr. Bedford. This information is truly invaluable, and especially as we are heading into an election year in 2024. And I hope this has been pretty informative for folks in that regard, and even beyond that, but how important these elections are. And then to quote from your last program, just because I love it so much, the potential for learning is immense. So thank you again for your time, and thank you again to all the attendees' time who come out for this. And then also I want to let everyone know that we are going to be sending a follow-up email, and it's going to be coming from CivicCLP@carnegielibrary.org, and that's going to be the resources from today's program, and also a brief survey so that we can continue to offer relevant library programs that our community is asking for.
Thank you so much for having me, and I have enjoyed my time with you. And thank you for all of you who have attended. Absolutely, you're welcome. So Britton will follow up with me if there are any questions that come to you after we end the podcast, and we'll be certain to give attention to that. And I will be making some additional book list recommendations and websites.
All right. Well, yes, go ahead and just shoot us an email. And yeah, that's been great. This has been wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great working with you too, Britton.
All right. Well, I guess we can say goodnight.
Good night. Good night, everyone.